announced Thursday that the college football playoff would be reevaluating their seeding process. And long story short, the 12-team format that we have last season, it's going to be a pretty straightforward format. It's going to be the highest ranked teams in exact order. There's going to be no longer conference champions getting 1 through 5. And all things considered, I mean, this was pretty inevitable because, as you know, the original college football playoff, as we know it, was originated back when the Pac-12 was still existing, back when everything was not being as realigned as much. There wasn't movement going to the ACC. There wasn't movement going to the Big Ten, and now it just feels a little bit more logical with kind of how it's all set up too. And I even speak for someone who, for example, somebody who's more of a casual fan. It's a lot more straightforward to explain that, hey, you look at the college football standings, whoever ends up being one of the top 12 teams, aside from the 5 conference champions, get in. And it's that simple. And you think to yourself too, for example, I think of Oregon, for example, if they had this format, for example, instead of Oregon having to play Ohio State in the Rose Bowl, you would have a pretty straightforward shot at either playing Boise. You'd play Boise State, Indiana, then you would beat them, and more than likely at least make into the Final Four, if not the national championship game. So all things considered, it seems pretty inevitable that this was going to happen too. And I am really happy, at least for now, that they are still making the conference champions relevant, because I think that was really the big question for me when they were meeting on Thursday was how much impact would they give the conference champions, because it's hard to find the balance between the two, right? Because I am a pretty firm believer that yes, you do need to make the conference champions matter, but I think with this format, it was almost just a little bit too much where, Arizona State and Boise State shouldn't necessarily being superseding teams who, only have 1 or 2 losses and play a significantly tougher schedule, which leads to, kind of the next moment here, which makes you think to yourself, hey, this is pretty much a short-term change in the sense that this is really only announced for this season. Everything can change in 2026. So there's still a lot of question marks in terms of what the direction of college football is going to be, and particularly what the Big Ten and the SEC, what cards are they going to play in terms of, are they still going to be pushing for the automatic bids, which, I've been pretty passionate on this program saying, hey, there shouldn't be any auto bids whatsoever. I don't care if I don't care if you finish third in the SEC or the Big Ten. You should have to earn your spot just like everybody else. And if you win your conference championship, that's one thing, because yes, you should be rewarded for winning your conference championship. And yes, it does matter when you play teams every single year and you don't beat them. That's quite frankly just things that should be matter and be relevant to begin with. But in any event, I mean, because you think about it from a logical perspective and all that stuff kind of plays together too. But it seems like to me, at least the financial implications to me is what ultimately is going to end up kind of moving things along and changing in some regard. Because according to ESPN or sorry, a New York Times article that Russo wrote, according to this, it's the revenue distribution for the 4 highest ranked conference champions is worth roughly $8 million, would stay the same for those teams. And even if they wound up ranked outside the top 4, that have earned their quarterfinals spot. So in any event, it seems like that the revenue structure, at least for the time being, is going to be staying relatively the same. And it's more or less like college football is in a holding pattern right now, right? Because we're getting to the point where the house settlement's going to be starting to come in. We're going to figure out the ramifications of that. We at least know for that the time being that this is really the most straightforward format, and everybody pretty much agrees on it, which is a huge positive too. And even as somebody who's a fan, I think for the most part, the only people who probably wouldn't really agree with it are the Boise States and the Arizona States, and some of the smaller schools who are like, hey, how are we supposed to get an at-large bid at this point when, unless we go undefeated, there really is no shot at doing that, because when you have the Alabamas of the world, the Ole Miss of the world, the South Carolinas of the world, there's going to be so many more teams fighting for those particular spots. And now, most importantly, more now than ever, resume is going to be such a big deal. So I'm definitely fascinated to see, going in 2026 and beyond, how different programs decide to shift their scheduling, because as you know, there are some teams like, South Carolina, for example, who decide to challenge themselves for the most part every year with playing different teams. And even Clemson, for example, they decided to play Georgia last year to start off the season and got their ass kicked. And then you fast forward to the end of the season, and they ended up being one of the biggest surprises, all things considered. I mean, Cade Klubnik was doing his thing. The Clemson defense really stuck through, and now you have Tom Allen, who I think is going to be a monumental difference maker for this program. So that just goes to show you, how much can change in just a short 3 month period of time. But aside from that, I mean, you got to admit, the biggest winner of this whole thing is Notre Dame. And I did an episode on Notre Dame a couple days ago, kind of talking about, all the positive things that are going on for them between, having Marcus Freeman spearheading that program. You have a number of defensive guys coming back. Sure, you have a little bit of a storyline with the quarterback and everything, but I still think for the most part, it's a big positive that they're not necessarily relying on transfers this season. And you got to admit they just had such a great freaking gig. And I know I really try not to hate on Notre Dame too much on this program, but when you have the NBC television agreement exclusively with them and being on Peacock, so any Notre Dame fan can have Peacock and have unlimited access to watching all their games independently. They don't even have to share with anybody. So you have that huge plus. And now with this new format, there is a possibility that they can get, one of the larger seats. I mean, now they can go. It doesn't really matter. There's no, limit. Whereas before they were limited to at the very best sixth, and even then, it's an uphill battle going from there. So when you think about Notre Dame, it just gives you even more leverage and even just a better position at the table, because I mean now damn sure that there's no way that they're ever going to join the ACC. And quite frankly, they're just in a really good spot between being able to negotiate this TV deal, getting a sliver of the pie of having a de facto conference that you can kind of call it that, but they're not necessarily a part of their, you know the revenue sharing or anything like that. It's just, hey, they can kind of pick their poison in terms of, hey, we want to schedule this team this year because we know that's going to sell, or we can play this team this year. And it's going to be fascinating to see as this kind of evolves, which how hard are certain programs really going to be trying to schedule Notre Dame every year? Because at this point, I mean, you have the game versus Clemson. You know that they're going to play USC, and hopefully they resolve that. I mean, I would imagine they're going to, but it doesn't make USC look good, all things considered. And when you also look at this, it kind of makes you wonder as well. I mean, the biggest people are going to benefit this obviously is just, really just making sure that your conference matters more now than ever, because it's easy to sit there and say that beginning of the year that, yeah, you play some cupcake non-conference teams and it all comes down to your conference. And I think that's really should be a big takeaway too, is regardless how you do it at the beginning of the season, what really ends up mattering is how you're finishing, how consistent you are, and the entire evolution in terms of how your program looks from day one to day 120, when we're talking about programs and late October, early November. Which programs we could be talking about in terms of who's going to be fighting for that conference champion spot, who can be an at-large bid, and most importantly, who are going to be the people that we're going to be talking about in the college football playoff. But ultimately, this seems like a really big positive in the right direction, even though it's only a temporary order. But nevertheless, we're going to hear from the committee sooner rather than later in terms of some potential ideas. But at least we can sleep knowing that, hey, this is the most logical progression moving forward. And even though there's so much uncertainty in college football, it's still exciting to see that, it's a lot more of a even playing field in terms of finding that balance between letting the smaller schools kind of have their shot too, but also rewarding teams for winning the games that they're supposed to be, and most importantly, getting in the conference championship game.